How many times have you been out with your camera and seen a great landscape? You tried to capture it with your camera, but when you preview the results in the back, you see everything's looking a little darker, a little bit greyer than the actual scene. The problem behind this generally is the contrast between the bright skies and the darker foreground elements, which the camera finds difficult to meter properly. We can correct this in Photoshop quite easily using the levels options. We can go up to the image, adjustments, and levels to prompt the levels dialog, or alternatively we can use an adjustment layer to bring up the same dialog but putting all the changes within its own layer so that our original background image is left untouched. If you're not familiar with levels, they're quite straightforward once you understand the basics. The interface is dominated by this graph, which represents the color data of our main image. At the moment, by default, you'll be looking at the RGB composite, i.e. the individual color channels merged into one graph. Colors within the left-hand side of the graph will indicate the darker tones of the image, while those towards the right will indicate the brighter colors. This is reflected, as you can see at the bottom, by the anchor points, which you can actually move around: the black point, the grey point, and the white point. Now these are used to determine which point of our graph we want to map to the brightest white of the image and the darkest black. So in other words, at the moment we have output levels that range from 0 to 255. That's 256 levels of grey effectively that runs through our image. You can see the output levels here. They range from pure black to pure white along this 256 level scale. However, our image, if you look at the graph, it sort of runs short, a little bit far from the actual white point. So this explains why our image is looking a little grey, a little darker, because the white points aren't actually white. Our black point isn't too bad, but if we simply click and drag on the white point anchor and match that along to our image, you'll see how that brightens up considerably. So I'm going to leave the white point matching the top of the graph there. If we preview that, you can see how that's automatically brightened up our image considerably. But you'll have to notice that when I move this, the white point, that the mid-tone slider moves in proportion with the black slider. So the midpoints are always halfway between the two. Okay, that's one way of quickly adjusting a contrast for your image. But as you can see from the image, the contrast could still be a little bit better. We've used the graph alone to determine where the black and the white point should be, and theoretically this should be adequate. However, in the case of this image, the white points are being set by very few highlights that are picked out in the sky, and the black points are sort of being matched by some of the shadows. A better way to do this is to use a more visual approach. If you hold down the Alt key while you're dragging the sliders, you'll notice that the image itself shifts into a grayscale version which just looks at the extreme contrast of the image. Now you'll see that the highlighted areas will begin to clip as we move further and further into the graph. Now we can see straight away that the highlights are occurring within the sky area. Now we can afford to blow out quite a few of these clouds. That's not going to be so much of a problem. So we can bring the white point in quite a way, and if we release that, we'll see that the image has brightened up quite a bit. Even the foreground elements are starting to shine a bit more. We can do the same with the black point. Hold down the Alt key, click along, and you'll see when areas of black are too intense to actually contain the color data. But again, we can afford to jump into this a little bit and lose a bit of detail in some of the darker shadows. And you'll see how if we preview the original image with the adjusted image, it's already looking much better. You can go further with that also by playing around with the midpoint. The midpoint slider we can use to boost some colours as well. We can just drag that left to brighten up the image or right to darken it. So depending on the image content, you can choose, and your preference of course, you can choose which where you want your midpoints to lie, so we can further bring out some of those midtones. So just with a small levels adjustment, you can see we've made a considerable difference to this particular image. Another useful feature you can use with levels is to enhance color content. Moving into one of the individual color channels, we can boost some of the colors here to actually increase the color. Boosting up the red will increase some of the reds, some of the blues, for example. You can see that by boosting some of the darker areas of the individual channels, you can really add some more color content to this. Probably don't want too much green because that'll introduce too much red. But you can see just with just a few adjustments to the overall RGB settings and to the individual channels, we've made a considerable difference between the original dull, overcast looking scene and a much brighter, much more vivid landscape.